Got this ache inside, can't shake it loose. Been sipping on lies, what's the fucking use? You left me here in this backwoods town. Now I'm seeing clear, everything's coming down. Moonshine meltdown, moonshine meltdown. Your words still burn like cheap whiskey. Heart won't turn from this misery. These dirt roads know all my damn shame. Watch the stars glow while I go insane. Moonshine meltdown, moonshine meltdown. Broke my mind, left me blind. Can't rewind what you did to me. Broke my soul, lost control. Paid the toll for believing you. Now I'm drinking deep from this bottle of hurt. Promises you keep are just fucking dirt. But I'll rise up strong from this mess you made. Prove your ass wrong, watch my debts get paid. Moonshine meltdown, moonshine meltdown. Moonshine meltdown, moonshine meltdown. Shine enough, shine enough.